Readers are welcome to leave comments in the comments section.
The city of Los Angeles did not sleep, it merely changed its breath. From the 20th floor of the glass tower in downtown LA, the freeway below looked like twin streams of molten gold and ruby, bleeding into the hazy horizon. Inside the studio of Vance Associates, the only illumination came from the soft, clinical glow of 3 monitor screens and the amber accent lights built into the concrete pillars. Linda adjusted the cuffs of her silk blouse, her fingers moving with the precise, practiced rhythm that defined every aspect of her life. She was a woman who lived by lines, straight, unyielding, and architecturally perfect. But tonight, the lines on her digital tablet were blurring. If we drop the cantilever by 3 feet, the terrace gains the southern exposure the client wanted, a voice murmured from behind her shoulder. Susan. Linda didn't start. She had trained herself not to, though the subtle scent of black tea and expensive leather that always accompanied Susan had already betrayed her presence. Susan leaned over the edge of the desk, resting one palm flat on the polished wood. She was close enough that the warmth radiating from her linen blazer cut through the air-conditioned chill of the office. 3 feet compromises the structural integrity of the lower atrium, Linda replied, her voice steady, cool, and entirely professional. She did not look up from the screen, though she could see the reflection of Susan's sharp jawline and loose, dark curls in the dark glass of the window. Then we reinforce the base, Susan said. Her tone carried that characteristic, low-register hum that made even the most mundane architectural discussions feel like an invitation to a secret. She shifted closer, her arm brushing against Linda's shoulder, a fleeting, feather-light contact that lingered in the space between them long after the movement stopped. We aren't here to build something safe, Linda. You didn't hire me for safe. Linda finally turned her head. Their faces were inches apart. In the dim light, Susan's eyes were the color of twilight over the Pacific, flecked with gold from the monitor's reflection. There was no hesitation in Susan's gaze, it was deliberate, grounded, and entirely focused on Linda's lips before rising to meet her eyes. I hired you because your portfolio was flawless, Linda countered, her breathing remaining even only through sheer force of will. I didn't realize it came with an appetite for structural chaos. Calculated chaos, Susan corrected, a slow smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She didn't pull back. Instead, she reached past Linda to grab the stylus, her fingers sliding over Linda's hand to guide the pen. The touch was unnecessary. Both of them knew it. Linda could have handed the stylus over, or Susan could have used her own tablet. Yet, neither moved away. The heat of Susan's palm pressed against the back of Linda's hand, anchoring her to the spot. The silence of the empty office stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation system. Look, Susan whispered, her breath brushing against Linda's cheek as she traced a new arc on the digital blueprint. See how the shadow falls now. It yields to the light. Linda wasn't looking at the shadow. She was hyper-aware of the contrast between Susan's relaxed posture and her own rigid stance. The tension between them wasn't the kind that snapped, it was the kind that stretched like a wire, humming with electricity under the surface. It had been there since Susan's first day 3 weeks ago, a quiet undercurrent during board meetings, an unwritten note in every shared email, a lingering look across a crowded conference table. But tonight, stripped of the daytime noise and the buffer of other colleagues, the reality of it was unavoidable. Linda gently extricated her hand from Susan's grip, stepping back just enough to reclaim her personal space, though her heart gave a traitorous thud against her ribs. It's past midnight, Susan. The presentation is at 9 tomorrow morning. We need to finalize the renders, not redesign the entire West Wing. Susan straightened up, letting her hand drop to her side. The stylus remained in her fingers, spinning lazily between her knuckles. You're hiding behind the deadline. I am managing a multi-million-dollar account, Linda said, walking over to the espresso machine in the corner of the room. The sharp click of her heels against the polished concrete floor broke the spell, re-establishing the boundary she desperately needed. There is a difference. Is there? Susan followed her, her movements fluid and unhurried. She leaned against the marble countertop next to the coffee maker, crossing her arms. You've checked the structural load 4 times today. The math is perfect, Linda. You're perfect. You're just looking for an excuse to stay awake so you don't have to think about what happens when this project ends. Linda paused, the silver espresso pot hovering over the machine. She looked at Susan, really looked at her. Susan had discarded her heels hours ago, now standing in white sneakers that made her look deceptively casual, yet the quiet confidence she radiated was entirely commanding. And what happens when it ends? Linda asked quietly, dropping the pod into the slot. The machine began to whir, filling the small kitchen nook with the rich, bitter aroma of roasted beans. Susan took a step forward, closing the distance Linda had just created. The playful demeanor vanished, replaced by an intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch away from the collar of Linda's blouse, before she gently tapped the silver necklace Linda wore. The metal clicked against Susan's fingernail. We won't have a reason to spend our nights in an empty building anymore, Susan said, her voice dropping an octave. And we'll have to decide if we're only brave when the sun goes down. Linda felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. The directness of the statement left no room for evasion. Susan wasn't playing a game, she was laying out the pieces and waiting for Linda to make a move. Instead of answering, Linda reached for the 2 espresso cups. As she handed one to Susan, their fingers brushed again. This time, Susan didn't let go immediately. She held the cup, but her thumb lightly stroked the side of Linda's wrist, right over the pulsing vein. The touch was warm, deliberate, and sent a jolt of heat straight to Linda's core. Linda looked down at their hands, then up into Susan's eyes. Susan. I know, Susan interrupted softly, though her thumb didn't stop its slow, intoxicating movement. Professional boundaries. The firm's policy. Your reputation. You seem very familiar with the reasons why this is a bad idea, Linda murmured, her voice losing its defensive edge, softening into something vulnerable that she rarely showed anyone. I've memoized them, Susan admitted, a faint, self-deprecating smile appearing on her face. But then I come into this room, and I see you working, and the reasons don't seem to hold much weight anymore. She released Linda's wrist, taking a sip of the espresso without breaking eye contact. The intensity shifted back into a simmer, the heavy pull lingering like smoke in the air. Linda took a slow breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She was the senior partner. She was the one who had built this department from the ground up. She shouldn't be affected by a new consultant's charm, no matter how brilliant or magnetic that consultant was. Yet, as she looked at Susan standing under the warm ambient light of the kitchen, she realized the defense she had built over the last 3 weeks was entirely illusionary. We have work to do, Linda said, though the words lacked their usual authority. It sounded more like a plea for sanity than an order. 10 minutes, Susan negotiated, setting her cup down on the counter. She stepped even closer, her presence completely enveloping. She reached out and took Linda's cup, setting it down next to hers. Give me 10 minutes where we don't talk about cantilevers, or clients, or tomorrow morning. Linda's back pressed slightly against the edge of the marble counter. And what do we do for 10 minutes? Susan reached up, her hand rising slowly, giving Linda ample time to pull away if she chose to. Linda didn't move. Susan's fingers gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind Linda's ear. Her fingertips were warm against Linda's skin, tracing the curve of her jawline before resting gently on the side of her neck. The intimacy of the gesture was staggering, yet it felt as natural as the LA skyline outside the window. We could start by admitting that neither of us is looking at the blueprints, Susan whispered, her face tilting slightly as she leaned in. The distance between them dissolved to nothing. Linda could feel the warmth of Susan's breath on her lips, a silent question hanging in the air. The anticipation was exquisite, a tight coil of energy waiting to spring. Linda's eyes fluttered shut for a brief second, her hands instinctively rising to rest against the lapels of Susan's blazer, feeling the steady, rapid beat of Susan's heart beneath the fabric. Then, the sudden, sharp chime of a cell phone on the desk broke the silence. The sound shattered the bubble instantly. Linda opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden intrusion of reality. Susan didn't pull away immediately. She let her hand linger on Linda's neck for a fraction of a second, a soft, regretful sigh escaping her lips before she stepped back. The client, Linda said, her voice slightly breathless as she straightened her blouse, trying to retrieve the mask of the professional partner. Always impeccable timing, Susan muttered, though there was a small, knowing smirk on her face as she watched Linda walk back to the desk. Linda picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly as she swiped the screen. It was a confirmation email from the printing vendor, a routine notification, but it served its purpose. It brought the walls back up. For the next 2 hours, they worked in a different kind of silence. The ambient tension remained, but it was channeled into the final details of the project. They worked side by side, their shoulders occasionally touching, their voices quiet as they finalized the presentation slides. The lingering heat of the kitchen encounter hung over them like a promise, unspoken but entirely understood. By 2:30 a.m., the final file was uploaded to the server. It's done, Linda announced, closing her laptop with a definitive click. She felt a wave of exhaustion hit her, but beneath it, the electric hum of Susan's presence kept her fully awake. Susan stood up from her chair, stretching her arms above her head. The movement caused her blazer to ride up slightly, revealing the clean lines of her waist. She looked tired, but her eyes were still bright, still fixed on Linda. A masterpiece, Susan said, gathering her things. The client will love it. Or they won't, and they'll be fools. Linda smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that she rarely allowed herself in the office. Thank you, Susan. For the extra hours. And for the calculated chaos. Anytime, partner, Susan said, emphasizing the last word with a playful tilt of her head. They walked out of the studio together, the glass doors clicking shut behind them, locking away the blueprints and the glowing monitors. The hallway was entirely dark, save for the green exit signs casting a soft glow on the carpeted floor. As they waited for the elevator, the silence returned, no longer tense, but heavy with the awareness of what had almost happened, and what was still waiting to happen. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, the doors sliding open to reveal the bright, mirrored interior. Susan stepped in first, turning around to face Linda. Linda stood on the threshold, looking at her. Are you coming? Susan asked, holding her hand over the door sensor. The elevator ride down would take less than a minute. The parking garage was empty. They would go to their separate cars, drive to their separate homes in different parts of the city, and tomorrow they would be the senior partner and the consultant again. Linda looked at Susan's hand on the sensor, then up into those twilight eyes that seemed to know exactly what she was thinking. Instead of answering, Linda stepped into the elevator. As the doors began to slide shut, sealing them into the small, private box traveling down into the heart of the city, Linda reached out and pressed the stop button on the panel. The elevator halted between floors with a gentle shudder. Susan's eyebrows rose, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her lips as she let her hand drop from the sensor. 10 minutes are over, Linda, Susan murmured, taking a step toward her. I know, Linda replied, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet confidence that matched Susan's own. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them once and for all. We're on my time now. The mechanical sigh of the elevator died away, leaving a silence so absolute that the hum of the overhead lead strip felt loud. The yellow emergency light threw long, sharp geometric shadows across the mirrored walls, repeating their reflections into infinity. Susan did not move. Her back remained rested against the handrail, her leather bag slung loosely over one shoulder. But her posture had shifted from casual amusement to a stillness that mirrored Linda's own. Her eyes followed Linda's hand as it retracted from the red control panel, then slowly rose to meet Linda's gaze. You pressed it, Susan said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was barely a murmur, catching on the quiet air of the shaft. I did, Linda replied. She didn't retreat to her corner of the carriage. Instead, she stood her ground in the center, the distance between them measuring less than 2 feet. You spent the last 2 hours telling me I was hiding behind deadlines and rules. I decided to test your theory. Susan's chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate breath. The playful smirk that usually defined her mouth faded, replaced by something much softer, much more dangerous. She stepped away from the rail, her white sneakers making no sound on the metal floor. And what is the verdict, partner? Susan asked, closing the remaining distance until the toes of their shoes almost touched. Linda had spent years managing people, negotiating contracts, and directing millions of dollars in construction assets. She knew how to read a room, how to control a narrative. But standing here, with the scent of Susan's black tea perfume trapped in a 10 by 10 steel box, her textbook strategies felt useless. She could see the faint pulse ticking at the base of Susan's throat, right above the open collar of her linen blazer. The verdict, Linda whispered, her voice dropping, losing the crisp edge she used in boardrooms, is that you are disruption, Susan. To my schedule. To my focus. To the way I view this entire office. Good, Susan said. She didn't look away. Her gaze was steady, heavy with an intensity that made the air feel thick. A perfectly balanced structure never grows, Linda. It just stands there until it gets old. You need a little kinetic energy. Susan raised her hand, her movements unhurried, giving Linda every opportunity to step back, to press the run button, to end the night. Linda stayed exactly where she was. Susan's fingers brushed the lapel of Linda's silk blouse, smoothing down a wrinkle that wasn't there. Her hand lingered on the fabric, the warmth of her knuckles seeping through the material to press against Linda's chest. I've spent 3 weeks watching you, Susan murmured, her eyes dropping to Linda's mouth before rising again. I watched you handle the city council members who tried to cut our budget. I watched you sketch the framework for the atrium using only 3 pencil strokes. And I watched the way you look at the clock every day at exactly 5 o'clock, wondering if you should leave or stay. Linda's breath caught. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed that. She had thought her armor was seamless. You were supposed to be reviewing the zoning laws, not me. The laws are boring, Susan whispered, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. She moved her hand from the blouse, her index finger tracing the line of Linda's collarbone up to the side of her neck. The touch was light, like a brush of silk, but it sent a sharp shiver straight down Linda's spine. You are much more interesting. Especially when you forget to be perfect. Linda felt her defenses melting away, pixel by pixel, under the heat of Susan's gaze. The rigid rules she had lived by for the last decade seemed to belong to a different woman, someone who lived in the daylight. Out there, in the sun, she was Linda Vance, senior partner. In here, suspended between the 19th and 18th floors of a silent tower, she was simply herself, entirely exposed to the woman in front of her. Susan, Linda said, her voice shaking slightly. It was a warning, but it sounded like an invitation. Tell me to press the button, Linda, Susan murmured, leaning in closer. Her breath was warm against Linda's lips, a sweet, quiet promise. Tell me to start the elevator, and I swear I will walk to my car, drive back to Silver Lake, and tomorrow I will call you Ms. Vance in front of the clients. Just say the word. Linda looked into Susan's eyes, searching for a trace of hesitation, but found only absolute certainty. The pull was magnetic, an undeniable force drawing them together. The space between them disappeared entirely as Linda reached out, her hands finding the lapels of Susan's blazer, anchoring herself to the moment. Don't you dare press that button, Linda whispered. Susan didn't wait. She tilted her head, her lips brushing against Linda's in a contact so soft it was almost agonizing. It wasn't a rushed movement, it was a slow, deliberate exploration. Linda let out a quiet breath against Susan's mouth, her eyes closing as the tension that had built up over the past 3 weeks finally broke. The kiss was sweet, lingering, and full of the unsaid words that had passed between them in emails and brief glances. Susan's hand moved to the back of Linda's neck, her fingers tangling gently in her hair, holding her close, while her other hand rested flat against the small of Linda's back, pulling her flush against her body. The warmth of Susan's embrace completely enveloped her, erasing the chill of the air-conditioned building. When Susan pulled back, just an inch, her forehead rested against Linda's. Both of them were breathing heavily, the rhythm syncopated in the small space. Susan's thumb stroked the line of Linda's jaw, her eyes dark, full of an affection that made Linda's heart ache in the best possible way. Calculated chaos, Susan whispered, her voice rough around the edges. Linda let out a breathless laugh, her hands still resting on Susan's shoulders. You're terrible for my blood pressure. I'm great for your architecture, Susan countered, the familiar, playful spark returning to her eyes, though her hand remained firmly around Linda's waist, unwilling to let go just yet. They stood there for a long minute, simply holding each other, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into the space. The elevator carriage remained perfectly still, a private sanctuary detached from the rest of Los Angeles. Finally, Linda took a reluctant step back, her hands sliding down Susan's arms until their fingers twined together. We should probably go before security notices the elevator has been stationary for 10 minutes. Let them watch the cameras, Susan smiled, though she reached out and pulled the red knob back into place. The elevator gave a small jerk, the lights flickering once before the smooth mechanism engaged again. The floor numbers on the digital display began to count down rapidly. 15, 12, 8:04. By the time the chime rang for the parking garage, they had stepped apart, reclaiming a respectable distance, though the air between them was still charged with the residue of the kiss. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the cavernous, concrete expanse of the subterranean level. The fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, casting a pale light over the rows of empty parking spaces. The cold air of the garage hit them instantly, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the elevator. Linda walked out first, the click of her heels echoing through the empty space. She reached into her bag for her keys, looking toward her sedan parked near the exit ramp. "Linda," Susan called out, stopping near the pillar where her own vintage SUV was parked. Linda turned around, her fingers wrapped around her key fob. "Yes." Susan leaned against the driver's side door of her car, tossing her keys in the air and catching them. "You're too tired to drive down the 110 freeway right now. You've been working for 16 hours. "I'm fine, Susan," Linda said, though the slight droop in her shoulders betrayed her words. "You're not fine. You're exhausted, and you're stubborn," Susan said, opening her passenger door with a theatrical flourish. "Leave your car here. Security keeps the garage locked until morning anyway. Let me drive you." Linda hesitated, looking at her own car, then back at Susan. The logical choice was to drive herself home, to have those 30 minutes of solitude to process everything. But as she looked at Susan standing under the pale garage lights, her jacket open, a hopeful expression on her face, the logical choice felt incredibly lonely. "And where are you taking me?" Linda asked, stepping away from her sedan and walking towards Susan's vehicle. "There's a taco truck on La Brea that stays open until 4 a.m., Susan said, her smile widening as she saw Linda approach. "Best carnitas in the city. And we can actually talk about something other than structural load." Linda stopped in front of the passenger door, looking up at Susan over the roof of the car. The midnight breeze from the entrance ramp swept through the garage, stirring the dark curls around Susan's face. "Is this part of your consultant duties?" Linda asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. "No," Susan said softly, her voice dropping the playful tone as she reached across the roof to touch Linda's fingers one last time before they got in. "This is entirely off the clock." Linda smiled, stepping into the passenger seat and pulling the heavy door shut. As Susan started the engine, the deep rumble filling the concrete garage, Linda looked out the window at the exit ramp ahead. The city was waiting, but for the first time in years, she wasn't the one driving the narrative, and she found she didn't mind the ride at all. The vintage SUV climbed the entrance ramp, its tires humming a low, rhythmic bass line as it merged onto the empty lanes of the interstate. Los Angeles at 3 in the morning belonged to a different world entirely. The aggressive, gridlocked beast of the daytime had dissolved into a vast, sprawling grid of amber streetlights and distant, blinking radio towers. Inside the cabin, the dashboard cast a soft green illumination over Susan's profile. She drove with one hand casually resting on the lower curve of the steering wheel, her posture relaxed but entirely attentive to the road ahead. A low, bluesy track played from the speakers, the volume kept just high enough to fill the gaps between their thoughts. Linda leaned her head back against the leather headrest, her eyes tracking the overhead freeway signs as they flashed past. Harbor Freeway. Santa Monica Freeway. For the first time in 3 years, she was in the passenger seat of a car that wasn't a rideshare, sitting next to a woman who had managed to dismantle her carefully constructed boundaries in the span of a single evening. "You're remarkably quiet," Susan observed without taking her eyes off the road. She reached down, adjusting the air vents so the warm air didn't blow directly into Linda's face. regretting the executive decision to halt public transportation between the floors. Linda let out a quiet, dry laugh, turning her head to look at Susan. The green light highlighted the sharp line of Susan's jaw and the slight, permanent crease between her brows when she concentrated. I don't make decisions I regret, Susan. I'm simply calculating the trajectory of tomorrow morning. Still thinking about the presentation? Susan asked, a faint note of disappointment clipping the edge of her words. No, Linda said softly. She reached out, her hand resting on the center console, just inches away from Susan's arm. I'm thinking about how I'm going to look the CEO of Vance Associates in the mirror tomorrow after what happened in that elevator. Susan's fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips, but she didn't reply immediately. Instead, she smoothly indicated a lane change, guiding the heavy vehicle off the freeway and down into the moonlit streets of Mid-City, heading toward La Brea. The taco truck was exactly where Susan had promised, parked beneath the sprawling branches of a massive jacaranda tree on a wide corner lot. A single string of yellow bulb lights stretched from the roof of the modified step van to a nearby utility pole, illuminating a small group of night shift workers and night owls waiting for their orders. The smell of charred meat, fresh cilantro, and grilled onions hung thick in the cool air, instantly cutting through the lingering exhaustion in Linda's chest. Susan parked the SUV along the curb just past the light radius, cutting the engine. The sudden silence inside the car felt different now, less like a standoff and more like a shared secret. Stay here, Susan said, unbuckling her seatbelt. I know the guy who runs this truck. He makes a specific hot sauce that isn't on the menu. You look like someone who appreciates hidden details. Linda watched her step out into the night, the loose fabric of her blazer catching the breeze as she walked toward the counter. There was an effortless grace to the way Susan moved through the world, an unbothered confidence that Linda had spent her entire life trying to manufacture through structure and control. Susan didn't need lines, she created her own space wherever she stood. A few minutes later, Susan returned carrying 2 paper plates wrapped in foil and a pair of glass soda bottles. Instead of getting back into the car, she tapped on Linda's window, gesturing toward the front hood of the SUV. Linda opened her door, the crisp night air catching her silk blouse. She climbed up onto the wide, flat hood of the vehicle, smoothing her skirt beneath her as she settled against the base of the windshield. Susan climbed up next to her, handing over a plate with a quiet, satisfied grin. To the survival of the West Wing blueprint, Susan said, clinking her glass bottle against Linda's. To calculated chaos, Linda corrected, taking a sip of the cold cane sugar cola. They ate in a comfortable, companionable silence, watching the occasional car cruise down La Brea, its headlights cutting paths through the low-hanging coastal fog. The warmth of the food and the informality of the setting worked a strange magic on Linda. The rigid posture she wore like armor began to soften. She looked down at her polished leather heels, dangling over the grille of a truck that had seen better decades, and felt a sudden, profound sense of freedom. How did you end up in LA? Linda asked, setting her plate aside. She turned her torso to face Susan, drawing one knee up toward her chest. Your resume says you spent 4 years in Chicago and 2 in Seattle before this. You don't exactly seem like someone who likes to settle down. Susan swallowed, staring out at the neon sign across the street. Her expression turned reflective, the playful mask slipping down to reveal the grounded, earnest woman beneath. LA was never the plan. I like places that are still figuring themselves out. Chicago has its history written in stone. Seattle is too damp to change quickly. But this place, it's entirely fluid. People come here to reinvent their geometry. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Linda with that unsettling, absolute focus. And what about you, Linda? You built this firm's division. You've been here since the foundation columns were poured. Why stay in one place for so long? Linda looked down at her hands, her thumb tracing the smooth band of her watch. Because when you build something from scratch, you become responsible for its weight. My father was a contractor. He used to tell me that a building only falls if the architect forgets to watch the corners. I guess I spent the last 10 years watching the corners so closely that I forgot there was an entire horizon outside the window. Susan didn't speak. She set her soda bottle down in the cowl of the windshield and moved closer, sliding her hand across the cold metal of the hood until her fingers brushed against Linda's wrist. The touch wasn't fleeting this time, it was deliberate and heavy with understanding. The corners are safe, Susan said softly, her thumb sliding up to trace the soft skin over Linda's pulse point, just as she had done in the office kitchen. But the horizon is where the light changes. You don't have to carry the weight of the entire structure by yourself anymore, Linda. Not when I'm in the room. The sincerity in Susan's voice hit Linda with the force of an physical impact. It wasn't flattery or corporate networking, it was an acknowledgement of the lonely reality Linda had chosen to live in for years. A lump formed in her throat, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. Instead of pulling away, Linda turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with Susan's. The contrast was distinct. Linda's fingers were cool and slender, Susan's palm was warm and slightly calloused from years of handling field site blueprints. The simple act of holding hands on the hood of a car in the middle of the night felt more intimate than the kiss in the elevator, a quiet closing of the final gap between them. Tomorrow morning is going to be difficult, Linda whispered, her eyes fixed on their joined hands. Tomorrow morning doesn't exist yet, Susan replied, her voice dropping into that low, magnetic register. She used her free hand to gently reach up, her fingers catching Linda's chin, turning her face until their eyes met. Right now, it's just the two of us, a terrible parking job on La Brea, and 5 hours before the sun comes up. Susan leaned in, her movements slow and predictable, giving Linda the space to choose. Linda didn't wait for the space to close on its own, she leaned forward, meeting Susan halfway. The second kiss was different from the first. The frantic energy of the elevator had settled into something deep, deliberate, and extraordinarily sweet. Susan's lips were warm, tasting faintly of sugar and the cool night air. She shifted closer, her arm coming around Linda's waist to pull her against her side, anchoring her against the slope of the windshield. Linda let her eyes close completely, her hand rising to cup the back of Susan's jaw, feeling the slight vibration of a contented sigh leave Susan's throat. When they parted, the cool air felt sharp against their lips. Susan didn't let go of Linda's waist, her fingers gently kneading the fabric of her blouse, keeping her close. Come on, Susan murmured against her hair. The fog is rolling in from the coast. Let me get you home before you freeze. The drive to Silver Lake was shorter than Linda wanted it to be. The SUV climbed the winding, narrow hills, the headlights illuminating the steep driveways and overgrown bougainvillea that characterized the neighborhood. Susan pulled up to the curb in front of a mid-century modern house nestled into the hillside, its glass facade reflecting the distant lights of the valley below. Susan left the engine idling, turning in her seat to look at Linda. The reality of the approaching morning was finally starting to color the edges of the sky, a faint, dark blue hue replacing the deep black of the midnight hour. Here we are, Susan said, her voice soft, almost reluctant. Linda unbuckled her belt but didn't make a move toward the door handle. She looked at Susan, the realization of what they had crossed tonight weighing heavily, beautifully, in the air between them. 9 o'clock sharp, Consultant Susan, Linda said, her professional tone returning, though it was laced with a warmth that had never been there before. The conference room on the 3rd floor. I expect your hair to be brushed and your revisions to be perfect. Susan chuckled, leaning across the center console until her face was inches from Linda's. She reached out, her fingers lightly tapping the tip of Linda's nose. I'll be the definition of corporate excellence, senior partner Linda. But the second that client signs the contract. Yes. Linda prompted, her breath catching as Susan's eyes darkened with anticipation. The second they sign, Susan whispered, her lips brushing the corner of Linda's mouth in a lingering, teasing promise, the clock stops again. And I'm taking you to a place that doesn't serve tacos. Linda smiled, a brilliant, unreserved expression that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. She opened the car door, stepping out into the cool morning air. She stood on the curb for a moment, watching Susan smile back at her through the open window. Good night, Susan, Linda said. See you at 9, boss, Susan replied with a wink. Linda walked up the concrete steps to her front door, the sound of the SUV's engine fading into the quiet hills behind her. As she unlocked her door and stepped into the quiet house, she didn't look at the clock. For the first time in her life, she didn't care about the time, she was only counting the hours until the presentation ended. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the downtown Los Angeles tower with an uncompromising, blinding glare. Gone were the amber and ruby ribbons of the midnight freeways, replaced by the relentless, gray grid of rush-hour traffic crawling along the 110. By 8:30 a.m., the 20th floor was no longer a silent sanctuary of shadows and shared secrets, it was a humming hive of ringing phones, clicking heels, and the sharp aroma of corporate-grade espresso. Linda stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her private office, a porcelain cup of black coffee held steadily in her right hand. She wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, the fabric stiff and immaculate. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless twist. To anyone passing her glass door, she was the epitome of executive composure, the senior partner who had everything under control. But beneath the cool exterior, her skin still carried the memory of the midnight wind on La Brea, and the ghost of Susan's lips against hers in the stalled elevator. A sharp knock broke her reverie. Enter, Linda said, her voice instantly snapping into the crisp, authoritative register she had used for a decade. The door swung open, and Susan walked in. True to Linda's instructions, her dark curls were neatly brushed, falling in soft, structured waves around her shoulders. She wore a tailored cream blazer over a dark silk shell, looking every bit the high-priced consultant the firm was paying for. But as she closed the door behind her, the formal posture relaxed just a fraction. Her eyes, still the color of a changing tide, locked onto Linda's with a directness that made the charcoal suit feel suddenly very thin. The digital folders are uploaded to the presentation screen in Boardroom A, Ms. Vance, Susan said, her voice perfectly formal, though there was a deliberate, agonizing playfulness in the way she articulated her name. The clients from the investment group have just arrived at reception. Linda turned around fully, setting her coffee cup down on the marble desk with a controlled click. She appraised Susan, her gaze sweeping down the cream blazer before returning to her eyes. And the structural revisions we finalized at 2 in the morning. Are they properly integrated into the primary render? Flawlessly, Susan replied. She took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them until she was standing just across the desk. She leaned forward slightly, resting her knuckles on the polished wood, mirroring her posture from the night before. But this time, the bright morning light exposed every detail. I reviewed them twice before the morning staff arrived. The cantilever yields to the light, just like we discussed. Linda felt a dangerous warmth bloom in her chest at the double meaning. She picked up her tablet, stepping out from behind the desk. As she passed Susan, their shoulders brushed, a brief, hard contact that was entirely unnecessary given the width of the office. "Let's not keep them waiting, then," Linda murmured, not looking back as she opened the door and led the way down the bustling corridor. Boardroom A was flooded with natural light, the massive mahogany table surrounded by 6 executives from the Meridian Investment Group. The air was thick with the tension of a multi-million-dollar decision. Linda took her place at the head of the table, her presence commanding immediate silence. Susan stood near the projection screen, her tablet in hand, the cool professional ready to deploy her brilliance. "Good morning, gentlemen," Linda began, her voice smooth and resonant, anchoring the room. "Today, we aren't just presenting a blueprint for the new arts complex. We are presenting a structure designed to redefine the silhouette of this city." With a subtle nod from Linda, Susan hit the remote. The lights dimmed slightly, and the high-resolution 3D rendering of the complex filled the wall. For the next 40 minutes, the presentation was a masterclass in professional synergy. Linda handled the macro narrative, the financial viability, and the overarching vision with the seasoned precision of a master architect. But whenever the clients pushed back on the structural risks or the radical nature of the design, Susan stepped in. "If you direct your attention to the western facade," Susan said, her voice commanding the room with an effortless authority that made Linda's pulse quicken. She walked toward the screen, her movements fluid. "The cantilevered terrace appears to defy gravity, yes. But by utilizing the reinforced carbon fiber trusses we developed for the lower atrium, the load is actually distributed inward, toward the central core." As Susan spoke, she glanced across the darkened room, her eyes finding Linda's in the dim light. It was a look of pure, unadulterated alignment, 2 minds working in perfect, unspoken harmony. To the clients, it was a display of technical excellence. To Linda, it was an exhilarating extension of the pull that had started weeks ago. The aesthetic audacity is what will drive the press, but the structural integrity is what guarantees your return on investment, Susan continued, her gaze lingering on Linda for a beat too long before she turned back to the investors. "Ms. Vance and I spent a significant amount of time analyzing the shadow play and the load factors last night. We ensured that no element of this design is safe. It is, instead, definitive." One of the lead investors, an older man with a reputation for being notoriously difficult to please, leaned forward, tapping his pen against the mahogany table. "It's a bold claim, Ms. Vance. The city hasn't approved a variance for a cantilever of this scale in 5 years." Linda smiled, a calm, measured expression that exuded absolute certainty. She stood up, walking down the length of the table toward the screen. As she reached Susan's side, she took the digital stylus from Susan's hand. The exchange was a masterpiece of subtext. As Susan handed over the stylus, her index finger slid slowly along the inside of Linda's wrist, a hidden, electric touch concealed from the investors by the angle of the podium. The warmth of Susan's skin sent a jolt straight up Linda's arm, but her voice didn't waver by a single vibration. "The city approves structures that elevate its status, Mr. Henderson," Linda said, her finger tracing a new vector on the screen with the stylus. "We have already submitted the preliminary wind tunnel data to the zoning board. The logic of this building is unassailable. We aren't asking you to gamble on a concept. We are asking you to own the future of the corridor. Susan stepped back slightly, allowing Linda to take the center stage, but her eyes never left Linda's profile. There was a look of profound respect, and something much softer, much hungrier, in Susan's expression as she watched Linda dismantle the investor's final objections with surgical precision. The silence that followed Linda's closing remarks stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, Mr. Henderson capped his pen. "The paperwork is in my briefcase," he said, a slow, appreciative nod acknowledging defeat. "Let's sign the contract before you ladies convince me to double the budget." The tension in the room broke instantly into a flurry of handshakes, rustling papers, and the scratch of fountain pens on heavy bond paper. Linda signed her name with her characteristic, elegant script, her hand steady, though the adrenaline of the victory was coursing through her veins. As the investors gathered their things and began to filter out of the boardroom, accompanied by the junior associates, the noise slowly drained from the space. The door clicked shut, leaving the massive room empty save for 2 people. Linda stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the back of the leather chair. The sun had shifted, casting long, bright rectangles across the mahogany surface. Susan remained by the screen, slowly packing her tablet into her leather briefcase. She didn't say anything until the heavy footsteps of the last investor faded down the hallway. "Corporate excellence," Susan said softly, quoting Linda's words from the morning. She snapped the brass latches of her briefcase shut and looked up. The formal mask was completely gone now, replaced by the intense, magnetic presence that had undone Linda the night before. "I believe my hair was brushed, and my revisions were deemed perfect." Linda let out a long, slow breath, the rigid posture of the senior partner finally dissolving. She walked around the table, her heels making a distinct, slow rhythm on the carpeted floor until she stopped just a foot away from Susan. "You were spectacular," Linda admitted, her voice dropping into the quiet, vulnerable register reserved only for this woman. "The investors were terrified of the design until you explained the load distribution. You have a way of making chaos sound entirely reasonable." "Only because I had a brilliant partner to anchor it," Susan murmured. She set her briefcase down on the table, stepping into Linda's personal space. The proximity was intoxicating, the contrast between their professional suits and the intense intimacy of their stance creating a delicious, forbidden friction. "The contract is signed, Linda. The project is officially ours." "Yes," Linda whispered, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs just as it had in the elevator. "It is." Susan reached out, her hand rising slowly until her fingers brushed the lapel of Linda's charcoal blazer. She didn't smooth the fabric this time, instead, her fingers slid beneath the lapel, her thumb resting against the warm skin of Linda's collarbone. The touch was possessive, grounded, and entirely off the clock. "Then by my calculations," Susan said, her voice dropping an octave, her twilight eyes darkening as she leaned in closer, "the clock has officially stopped. And you owe me a destination that doesn't serve tacos." Linda didn't pull back. She looked at Susan's lips, then up into her eyes, a beautiful, unreserved smile finally breaking across her face. "Name the place, Susan." "My apartment," Susan whispered, her breath warm against Linda's cheek as she tilted her head. "I make a phenomenal espresso, and the view of the hills is almost as beautiful as the woman standing in front of me." Linda reached up, her hand tangling in the dark curls at the back of Susan's neck, pulling her down into a swift, sweet kiss that sealed the promise of the night to come. The boardroom doors were made of glass, but in that moment, under the brilliant LA sun, Linda didn't care who was watching. The lines had finally broken, and she had no intention of fixing them. The transition from downtown Los Angeles to Silver Lake was not merely a matter of miles, it was a slow, deliberate shedding of altitude and attitude. As Linda's sedan wound upward through the narrow, curving streets, the clinical glass towers of the financial district vanished behind the crest of the hills, replaced by sprawling bougainvillea, mid-century bungalows clinging to steep slopes, and the soft, amber glow of porch lights. In the passenger seat, Susan had already dismantled her corporate silhouette. Her cream-colored blazer was draped over the back of the seat, her dark silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She sat with one foot tucked under her thigh, her head resting against the glass as she watched the twilight sky turn from a bruised gold to a deep, velvety violet. "You drive like an architect," Susan murmured, her voice carrying a lazy, post-victory warmth. "Very precise apexes on the turns. No wasted kinetic energy." Linda kept her eyes on the road, though a small smile played at the corner of her lips. "If you don't take these hills precisely, the local residents will happily clip your bumper. This is a highly defensive driving environment. And you are always on the defensive, aren't you?" Susan softly challenged, her eyes shifting from the window to Linda's profile. Linda didn't answer, but she felt the familiar, pleasant flutter in her stomach, the one that had nothing to do with deadlines or client approvals. She turned the steering wheel sharply to the left, pulling the car up to the curb in front of a weathered cedar shingle duplex that seemed to float among the eucalyptus trees. "We're here," Susan said, opening her door before the engine had even fully died down. Entering Susan's apartment felt like stepping inside her mind. Unlike Linda's minimalist, white-on-white penthouse in DTLA, Susan's space was a rich, tactile tapestry. High-vaulted ceilings with exposed pine beams held hanging ferns that trailed down like green waterfalls. Shelves were crammed with art monographs, structural design books, and a sprawling collection of vinyl records. In the corner, a drafting table was buried under charcoal sketches, tracing paper, and smooth river stones used as paperweights. The air smelled of cedar, old paper, and dried lavender. Linda stood in the entryway, her leather heels clicking softly on the dark hardwood floors. She felt suddenly very formal, very structured, in her grey charcoal suit. "It's highly organic," Linda noted, her eyes tracing the chaotic line of a handmade ceramic vase on the mantelpiece. "That's a polite way of saying it's a mess," Susan laughed. She walked over to a vintage turntable in the corner, gently dropping the needle onto a spinning record. The warm, crackling brass of a Chet Baker trumpet solo immediately filled the room, instantly softening the sharp angles of Linda's posture. "But every piece has its load-bearing purpose, I promise. Now, take off that jacket before you look like you're about to audit my kitchen." Susan stepped closer, her movements natural and unbothered by the lingering professional distance Linda was trying to maintain. Before Linda could object, Susan's hands found the shoulders of her charcoal blazer. The touch was firm but remarkably gentle. Susan slid the heavy wool fabric down Linda's arms, her knuckles lightly brushing against the silk of Linda's shirt. Linda felt a sudden breathlessness seize her. Stripped of her jacket, she felt exposed, yet when she turned to face Susan, she saw only a quiet, grounded warmth in her eyes. Susan hung the blazer on a wooden peg near the door, then turned back, her gaze lingering on the delicate line of Linda's exposed collarbone. "Better," Susan murmured, her voice dropping into a softer register. "Now, go sit down. Or, if you insist on being useful, you can open the wine." She pointed to a dark green bottle of Pinot Noir resting on the kitchen island. The kitchen was small, separated from the living room only by a reclaimed wood counter. Pots and pans hung from iron hooks overhead, and jars of spices were crowded onto open shelves without any discernible order. Linda walked over to the island, picking up the corkscrew. She operated it with her usual efficiency, but her eyes kept drifting to Susan, who had tied a dark canvas apron around her waist. Susan was already moving around the space with a rhythmic, messy confidence, crushing garlic cloves with the flat of a knife, slicing cherry tomatoes so that the juices pooled on the wooden cutting board, and tearing fresh basil leaves by hand. "There is absolutely no measuring happening here," Linda observed, pouring the dark red wine into two mismatched crystal glasses. "Cooking isn't drafting, Linda," Susan said, not looking up as she slid the garlic into a pan of shimmering olive oil. The sizzle was immediate, filling the air with a rich, savory aroma. You don't need a ruler to know when something tastes right. You just have to trust the ingredients. And the timing. Susan paused, turning her head to look at Linda. The steam from the pan rose between them, catching the golden light of the under-cabinet lamps. "Do you trust my timing?" Linda walked over, carrying the two glasses. She handed one to Susan, their fingers brushing over the stem. The contact felt deliberate, a slow-burning spark that had been smoldering all day. "I'm in your house, drinking your wine, watching you ruin a perfectly good recipe. I think my trust is fairly well established." Susan laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made Linda's chest tighten with a sweet, unfamiliar warmth. She took a sip of the wine, her eyes never leaving Linda's. "It's not ruined. It's calculated chaos. It's the only way to make pasta." For the next half hour, they worked in a shared, intimate rhythm. Under Susan's light-hearted direction, Linda was tasked with stirring the sauce. It was a simple task, but Susan kept finding excuses to correct her technique, stepping up behind Linda to place her hand over hers on the wooden spoon. The physical proximity was intoxicating. Linda could feel the steady rise and fall of Susan's chest against her back, the warmth of Susan's breath against her neck as she whispered instructions. "Slow, circular motions," Susan murmured, her fingers curling over Linda's. "Don't rush it. Let the tomatoes break down on their own." Linda let her eyes close for a brief second, leaning back slightly into Susan's embrace. The tension of the entire week, of the presentation, of the years she had spent building her career, seemed to evaporate in the heat of the small kitchen. Here, she didn't have to be the pillar of strength. She could simply let herself be guided. When the pasta was finally ready, they didn't eat at the counter. Instead, Susan led Linda out through a set of French doors onto a small, secluded balcony. The night air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and the distant, damp humidity of the Silver Lake Reservoir below. Below them, the lights of Los Angeles stretched out like a fallen constellation, a glittering carpet of gold and white that seemed to hum with quiet energy. They sat on a low, comfortable woven sofa, the plates of steaming pasta on a low table between them. The only light came from a string of small, warm-toned bulbs woven through the wooden railing of the balcony and the distant glow of the city. "It's beautiful," Linda said softly, her eyes tracing the dark outline of the reservoir against the grid of lights. "My place in DTLA has a view, but it feels like you're looking at a model. It's too high up, too disconnected. Here, you can actually hear the city breathing." "That's because you live in a fortress," Susan said gently, setting her empty plate aside and turning to face Linda. She drew her knees up onto the sofa, resting her chin on them. "A very beautiful, very expensive fortress. But a fortress nonetheless." Linda looked down at her wine glass, swirling the dark liquid. The conversation had shifted, the playful banter of the kitchen settling into the quiet, vulnerable space that always seemed to open up between them when they were alone in the dark. "I had to build it," Linda said, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the leaves in the canyon below. "When I started at Vance, I was the only woman in the design department. Every drawing I made was scrutinized twice as hard as my male colleagues. If I showed a single crack, a single moment of doubt, they would have used it to tear down everything I had built." She paused, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "My father worked on construction sites his entire life. He had these rough, scarred hands, and he used to tell me that the world doesn't forgive a weak foundation. I guess I took that too literally. I built my foundation out of steel and glass, and I forgot to leave a door." Susan watched her, her expression incredibly soft, devoid of any of her usual teasing sharpness. She reached out, her hand sliding over Linda's knee to cover her wrist, her thumb gently stroking the soft skin. "You left a door," Susan whispered. "You just locked it. And you've been waiting for someone who didn't mind looking for the key." Linda looked up, her eyes meeting Susan's in the dim, golden light of the balcony. The honesty in Susan's face was striking, a clear, beautiful mirror reflecting back all the things Linda had tried so hard to hide from the world. "Did you find it?" Linda asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't need a key," Susan said, a faint, tender smile playing on her lips. She slid closer, her movement fluid, until her leg was pressed against Linda's. She reached up, her hand gently cupping Linda's jaw, her thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I just knocked. And you let me in." The simplicity of the statement broke through the last of Linda's defenses. A single, quiet tear slipped from the corner of her eye, catching the light of the city below. Susan didn't say anything, she simply wiped the tear away with her thumb, her touch so light it felt like a promise. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Linda," Susan murmured, leaning in until their forehead met. "Not with me. You can let the structure fall. I'll help you rebuild it. Or we can just live in the ruins for a while." The vulnerability of the moment was overwhelming, a sweet, heavy wave of emotion that pulled them together. Linda reached out, her hands finding the soft fabric of Susan's dark silk shirt, pulling her closer as she closed the distance between their lips. The kiss was entirely different from the ones before. It wasn't born of the high adrenaline rush of the office or the playful defiance of the elevator. It was slow, deep, and filled with a profound, quiet tenderness that made Linda's heart ache with a fierce, beautiful intensity. Susan's lips were warm and soft, tasting faintly of the sweet Pinot Noir, parting easily under Linda's gentle pressure. Susan's arm came around Linda's waist, pulling her flush against her body, while her other hand tangled in the dark curls of Linda's hair, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The cool canyon breeze swept over the balcony, but neither of them felt it, wrapped in the absolute warmth of their embrace. When they finally parted, their breathing was shallow, their eyes reflecting the glittering lights of the city below. Susan rested her cheek against Linda's temple, her hand still resting flat against Linda's back, her fingers tracing slow, comforting circles over her spine. Linda let her head rest on Susan's shoulder, her eyes closing as she listened to the steady, reassuring beat of Susan's heart beneath her ear. The city of Los Angeles stretched out below them, vast and chaotic, but for the first time in her life, Linda felt entirely, perfectly balanced. "Stay tonight," Susan whispered into her hair, her grip tightening just a fraction. Linda smiled in the dark, her fingers tightening on Susan's shirt. "I don't have my things. I have a very comfortable t-shirt, a spare toothbrush, and absolutely no blueprints, Susan murmured, her voice vibrating with a quiet, happy warmth. And the morning doesn't start for a very long time. Linda let out a soft laugh, her chest rising and falling against Susan's. She looked out at the lights of Silver Lake, the water of the reservoir reflecting the stars above, and realized that some rules were meant to be broken, especially the ones you built to protect yourself. Okay, Linda whispered, her heart full as she turned her head to press a soft kiss to Susan's shoulder. I'll stay. Dawn did not burst into the Silver Lake cottage. It filtered in like liquid amber, sliding across the low-slung platform bed and painting long, warm rectangles on the cedar floorboards. Outside, the morning breeze stirred the eucalyptus leaves, creating a rhythmic, rustling soundtrack that gently pulled Linda from her sleep. She did not open her eyes immediately. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the internal alarm clock that ruled her life, the sharp, demanding voice that calculated schedules and budget sheets the moment she crossed the threshold of consciousness, was entirely silent. Instead, her awareness settled on physical sensations. The texture of washed linen sheets against her legs. The deep, grounding scent of black tea and cedar wood that enveloped the pillows. And the weight of the fabric she was wearing. Linda opened her eyes and looked down. The tailored silk blouse and charcoal skirt from yesterday were gone, hanging neatly on a wooden valet stand near the closet. In their place, she was swimming in a faded, oversized black cotton t-shirt that belonged to Susan. The hem reached midway down her thighs, and the neckline slipped off her right shoulder, exposing her collarbone to the cool morning air. It was entirely uncharacteristic, entirely UN architectural, and she had never felt more comfortable. She turned her head. The other side of the bed was empty, the sheets tossed back in a casual wave. From the kitchen down the hall came the low, metallic clatter of a mocha pot being assembled and the unmistakable, rich aroma of espresso beans being ground by hand. Linda slipped out of bed, her bare feet meeting the warm hardwood floor. She walked down the narrow hallway, the oversized shirt swaying around her knees. Susan was leaning against the kitchen counter, her back to the hallway. She wore heather gray sweatpants and a tank top, her dark curls gathered into a loose, messy knot at the crown of her head. She was holding a silver spoon, waiting for the espresso to rise through the central column of the mocha pot on the stove. The morning sun streamed through the open French doors behind her, haloing her silhouette in bright, golden light. Linda paused in the archway, simply watching her. The quiet confidence Susan wore during daytime presentations was still there, but it had softened into a relaxed, domestic grace that felt incredibly private. As if sensing her presence, Susan turned her head. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, her eyes sweeping down Linda's form, taking in the sight of the senior partner wearing her laundry. "Good morning, boss," Susan murmured, her voice carrying a gravelly, morning rasp that sent a familiar, pleasant shiver down Linda's spine. "I see the corporate dress code has significantly deteriorated." Linda walked into the kitchen, her steps unhurried. She leaned against the opposite side of the counter, crossing her arms. The oversized sleeve slipped lower on her shoulder. "I was told by a very expensive consultant that a structure needs kinetic energy to grow. I'm simply testing the elasticity of the fabric." "It suits you," Susan said, stepping away from the stove. She closed the distance between them, her movements fluid and natural. She stopped just inches away, her eyes locking onto Linda's with a warmth that made the bright morning feel even brighter. She reached out, her fingers gently catching the fallen sleeve of the shirt and tugging it back up over Linda's shoulder, her knuckles lingering against the warm skin of Linda's neck. Though I think my clothes look better on you than they do on me. That's a highly biased evaluation, Linda whispered, her voice softening as she looked into Susan's twilight-colored eyes. I'm paid for my expert evaluations, Susan countered softly. She didn't drop her hand. Instead, her thumb traced the line of Linda's jaw, her touch firm and grounding. She leaned in, her lips meeting Linda's in a quiet, lingering morning kiss. It tasted of clean air and the faint bitterness of coffee, a gentle extension of the promises they had made under the stars few hours before. When Susan pulled back, the mocha pot behind her began to sputter, its frantic gurgle signaling the completion of the brew. Susan turned back to the stove with a reluctant sigh, cutting the flame. Perfect timing, Linda said, watching Susan pour the dark, thick espresso into 2 small ceramic cups. The timing is always perfect when you stop watching the clock, Susan said, handing a cup to Linda. She picked up her own and pointed toward the open French doors. Come on. The fog hasn't completely cleared from the valley yet. They walked out onto the balcony, the concrete and glass of the city center still hidden behind the morning mist rising from the Silver Lake Reservoir. The air was crisp, making the warmth of the ceramic cups in their hands feel distinct and necessary. They sat close together on the woven sofa, Linda's legs tucked under the oversized shirt, her shoulder pressed firmly against Susan's side. Susan took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to burn through the marine layer. By 10 o'clock, the legal team at Meridian is going to send over the finalized escrow documents. We'll be buried under structural engineering reviews by noon. Linda rested her head against Susan's shoulder, watching the way the sunlight caught the green leaves of the jacaranda tree below them. Let them send it. The foundation is solid. We proved that yesterday. We did, Susan agreed, her arm sliding around Linda's waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Her fingers gently kneaded the soft cotton of the shirt over Linda's hip. But what happens when we walk back through those glass doors, Linda? Yesterday we had the excuse of the deadline. Today, we're just the senior partner and the independent consultant again. Linda turned her face into Susan's neck, inhaling the familiar scent of her skin. The question wasn't unexpected. It was the reality they had both been tracking since the elevator stopped between the floors. The corporate world was built on lines and boundaries, and they had spent the last 24 hours crossing every single one of them. We don't change the narrative out there, Susan, Linda said quietly, her voice steady and resolute. She lifted her head, looking directly into Susan's eyes. In the office, we are exactly who we need to be. We are precise, we are professional, and we are going to build the most audacious arts complex this city has ever seen. We don't give them a single crack to look through. Susan watched her, her expression serious, her thumb continuing its slow, soothing circle against Linda's waist. And in here, Linda whispered, her hand rising to cup Susan's cheek, her fingers tangling in the loose curls near her ear. The lines don't exist. The clock stops the moment we leave the freeway. We don't owe the firm our nights. A slow, beautiful smile broke across Susan's face, the slight tension in her shoulders vanishing entirely. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against Linda's. A dual occupancy structure. Strict boundaries on the exterior, entirely fluid on the inside. I like the architecture of that. I designed it myself, Linda smiled, her lips brushing against Susan's as she spoke. They finished their coffee in a comfortable, shared silence, watching the fog fully dissolve to reveal the glittering expanse of the city below. The real world was waiting, but the fear that had kept Linda locked inside her fortress for years had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty. An hour later, the domestic warmth of the Silver Lake cottage was replaced by the preparation for the day. Linda stood in front of the bedroom mirror, buttoning her white silk blouse with steady fingers. She stepped into the charcoal skirt, zipping it up with a practiced, sharp movement. She adjusted her watch, the ticking of the hands no longer sounding like a countdown, but rather a rhythm she was fully in control of. Susan walked in, fully dressed in her dark trousers and cream blazer, her briefcase in hand. She stopped behind Linda, looking at their reflection in the glass. They looked like a formidable corporate team, sharp, immaculate, and entirely distant. But as Susan reached out to adjust the collar of Linda's blouse, her fingers lingered against the skin of Linda's throat for a fraction of a second, a hidden, intimate touch that only the mirror witnessed. "Ready, Miss Vance?" Susan asked, a dangerous, beautiful spark dancing in her eyes. "Always, Consultant Susan," Linda replied, her voice crisp and professional, though her eyes crinkled at the corners. They walked down the concrete steps of the duplex together, the morning sun now bright and hot over the hills. As they got into Linda's sedan, the engine purred to life, a steady hum that matched the focused energy in their chests. The drive down the 110 freeway was smooth, the traffic moving with a steady, predictable flow. As the glass towers of downtown LA loomed larger through the windshield, Linda reached across the center console. She didn't look away from the road, but her hand found Susan's, their fingers twining together over the leather surface. Susan squeezed back, a firm, reassuring pressure that anchored them both. They pulled into the subterranean parking garage, parking in the exact spot near the exit ramp from the night before. Linda cut the engine, the sudden silence inside the car filling with the weight of the day ahead. They released their hands, the physical distance re-establishing itself before they even stepped out of the vehicle. As they walked toward the elevator banks, their heels clicking in a synchronized, powerful rhythm against the concrete floor, they were once again the senior partner and the top consultant. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, familiar chime. They stepped inside, the bright, mirrored interior reflecting their sharp silhouettes. Two other associates from the marketing department scrambled in behind them, nodding respectfully to Linda. "Good morning, Miss Vance," one of the associates said, holding a stack of folders. "Good morning," Linda replied, her voice cool, collected, and entirely professional as she looked straight ahead at the digital floor display. Susan stood beside her, her briefcase held firmly at her side, her eyes fixed on the doors. She didn't look at Linda, and Linda didn't look at her. But as the elevator began its smooth, vertical ascent toward the 20th floor, Susan's left foot shifted just an inch, the edge of her clean white sneaker lightly tapping against the heel of Linda's polished pump. It was a hidden vector, a tiny, calculated movement invisible to the rest of the world. Linda kept her gaze fixed on the glowing numbers above the door, her expression flawlessly stoic. But beneath the charcoal suit, her heart gave a steady, joyful thud, fully aware that while they were built to withstand the pressure of the daylight, the horizon belonged entirely to them. 2 weeks into the execution phase of the Meridian project, the 20th floor had transformed into a battlefield of logistical precision. The abstract beauty of the initial sketches had given way to the cold, unforgiving reality of structural calculations, zoning permits, and material procurement sheets. The office was constantly loud with the sounds of large-format plotters rolling out technical drawings and the sharp, urgent discussions of engineers debating load paths. Through it all, the invisible architecture Linda and Susan had designed for themselves held perfectly. During the day, they were a flawless mechanism. In coordination meetings, Linda sat at the head of the long table, the absolute center of authority, her voice cutting through disputes with cool, logical finality. Susan sat 3 chairs down, the brilliant, unpredictable consultant who could solve a spatial crisis with a single, radical suggestion. They rarely looked directly at one another for more than 3 seconds. They kept their notes formal, their emails concise, and their handshakes strictly corporate. But beneath the surface of the daylight routine, the tension didn't disappear, it merely compressed, gaining a dense, heavy energy that waited for the sun to drop below the horizon. It was nearly 7 in the evening when the model room finally fell silent. The junior designers and model makers had left for the day, leaving behind a chaotic landscape of laser-cut acrylic shards, white foam board blocks, bottles of solvent glue, and green cutting mats scored with thousands of knife lines. In the center of the room stood the primary presentation model of the arts complex, a massive, 4-foot-long miniature constructed from translucent plastic and dark walnut wood. Linda stood over the model, her jacket removed, the sleeves of her white silk blouse rolled up twice to protect them from the dust. She held a tiny pair of tweezers, attempting to place a miniature scale model of a jacaranda tree onto the wooden plaza terrace. Her fingers, usually entirely steady, gave a slight, uncharacteristic twitch, dropping the tiny plastic tree sideways into a gap between the structural columns. "Your tolerance is off by 2 millimeters, a voice remarked from the doorway. Linda did not look up, but her chest tightened instantly with a familiar, warm rhythm. The sound of the door clicking shut behind Susan was the official signal that the daylight rules had expired. Susan walked into the room, her footsteps slow and deliberate against the linoleum floor. She had discarded her blazer hours ago, her dark shirt unbuttoned at the throat, her curls slightly whirled from a long afternoon spent arguing with the mechanical engineers. She carried 2 small containers of iced matcha from the cafe downstairs. She set the drinks down on a nearby drafting table and walked up behind Linda, her presence immediately cutting through the sterile, chemical smell of the model room with her signature scent of black tea and leather. The landscape architect specified 5 trees for the eastern plaza, not 4, Susan murmured, leaning over Linda's shoulder to look at the fallen plastic miniature. Her front brushed lightly against Linda's back, a fleeting, intentional contact that sent a sharp current of electricity straight through Linda's charcoal skirt. "Are you trying to cut corners on the greenery, Ms. Vance?" Linda kept her eyes fixed on the model, though her breathing had already shifted, losing its professional regularity. "The scale of the trees is incorrect, Susan. If we place all 5, it crowds the sightlines toward the lower atrium. The structure needs breathing room. The structure needs to look alive," Susan countered softly. She reached out, her fingers sliding down Linda's forearm, her skin warm and slightly rough against the smooth silk of Linda's sleeve. She took the tweezers from Linda's fingers, her palm resting over the back of Linda's hand for a beat longer than necessary. "Let me show you." Instead of using the tweezers, Susan reached into the small box of plastic trees with her bare fingers. She leaned further over the table, her hip pressing firmly against Linda's side, anchoring them both to the edge of the display board. With a precise, delicate movement, she placed the miniature tree at a slight angle near the edge of the cantilevered deck, allowing its plastic branches to overhang the lower level. "See?" Susan whispered, her breath warm against Linda's ear. "It creates a narrative. It tells the client that the building isn't just standing there, it's interacting with the environment. It yields." Linda finally turned her head, her face inches from Susan's profile. In the harsh, overhead fluorescent light of the model room, Susan looked entirely focused, her jaw set in that expression of quiet determination she wore when she was solving a problem. But as she felt Linda's gaze, her eyes shifted, the twilight-colored depths darkening with an intensity that had nothing to do with architecture. "You like things that lean over the edge, don't you?" Linda said, her voice dropping into that quiet, intimate register that existed only between them. "I like things that have the courage to defy gravity," Susan replied, turning her body fully to face Linda. She rested her knuckles against the edge of the wooden model base, effectively trapping Linda between her arms and the table. The proximity was absolute, the air between them thick with the residue of 2 weeks of forced professional distance. "And I like women who know exactly how much stress a structure can take before it breaks." Linda's hands found the edge of the drafting table behind her, her fingers curling over the cold metal rim. The contrast between her rigid, formal posture and Susan's relaxed, commanding stance was intoxicating. "We have a coordination meeting with the city planning department at 8 tomorrow morning, Susan. I need to review the structural load sheets, not debate philosophy." "The sheets are done," Susan murmured, taking a step closer until the fabric of her dark trousers brushed against Linda's skirt. She raised her hand, her fingers slowly tracing the line of Linda's silver watch band before moving up to touch the soft skin of her wrist. "I sent them to your assistant 20 minutes ago." "You have no excuses left for the night, Linda." The directness of the statement made Linda's heart hammer against her ribs. She looked down at Susan's hand, then up into her eyes, the last remnants of her corporate defense melting away under the heat of Susan's gaze. "You are incredibly disruptive to my efficiency." "Efficiency is overrated," Susan whispered, her hand moving up to the collar of Linda's blouse. Her fingers gently tucked the silk fabric aside, her thumb resting against the rapid, erratic pulse at the base of Linda's throat. The touch was light, but the possessive weight of it anchored Linda to the spot. "Give me 5 minutes where you aren't the senior partner." "Just 5. Linda didn't answer with words. She reached up, her hands sliding up the lapels of Susan's shirt, her fingers tangling in the dark curls at the back of Susan's neck. She pulled Susan down, closing the remaining distance between them with a sudden, fierce hunger that had been building through every formal email and polite nod they had exchanged over the last 14 days. The kiss was intense, deliberate, and full of a sweet, controlled friction. Susan let out a quiet, rough sigh against Linda's mouth, her arm coming around Linda's waist to lift her slightly against the edge of the drafting table, pulling her flush against her body. The warmth of the embrace completely erased the sterile chill of the office. Linda let her eyes close, her hands gripping Susan's shoulders as the reality of the empty building settled around them like a protective shield. Susan's lips moved down to the curve of Linda's jaw, her kisses soft and lingering, before returning to the sensitive skin of her neck. Linda's head tilted back, her breath hitching as Susan's thumb continued its slow, intoxicating movement against her pulse point. "We are going to get caught one of these days," Linda whispered against Susan's hair, though she didn't make any move to pull away. Her fingers tightened on Susan's shirt, pulling her even closer. "The cleaning crew doesn't come to this floor until midnight," Susan murmured against her skin, her voice vibrating with a quiet, happy certainty. She pulled back just an inch, her forehead resting against Linda's, her eyes bright with a playful, dangerous spark. "And the security guards down in the garage are currently watching the Lakers game." "I checked the schedule." Linda let out a breathless laugh, her hands sliding down to rest on Susan's chest, feeling the rapid, steady beat of her heart beneath the dark fabric. "You are terrifyingly thorough when it comes to breaking the rules." "I told you," Susan smiled, her lips brushing the corner of Linda's mouth in a teasing promise. Calculated chaos. Every risk is properly accounted for. They stood there for a long time, suspended in the quiet light of the model room, simply holding each other as the distant sounds of traffic on the freeway below drifted through the glass. The professional mask was completely gone, replaced by a deep, mutual understanding that didn't require structure or lines to exist. Finally, Susan stepped back a fraction, though her hand remained firmly twined with Linda's, her thumb rubbing the back of Linda's fingers. She reached over with her free hand, picking up one of the iced matchas and handing it to Linda. "Come on," Susan said, her voice returning to a softer, gentler tone. "Let's get out of here before you start recalculating the wind tunnel data in your head." "Where are we going?" Linda asked, taking a sip of the cold drink, the sweetness cutting through the dry air of the office. Susan picked up her briefcase from the floor, tossing her blazer over her shoulder with that effortless, unbothered grace that Linda had grown to love. She looked at Linda, a beautiful, knowing expression settling into her eyes. "There's a small jazz club in Koreatown," Susan said, guiding Linda toward the door. "No architects allowed. No blueprints on the tables. Just dark corners, good music, and a senior partner who is officially off the clock." Linda smiled, a brilliant, unreserved expression that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. She reached for her jacket on the valet stand, but before she could put it on, Susan took it from her hands, carrying it for her as they walked out into the dim hallway. As the glass doors of the studio clicked shut behind them, locking away the plastic models and the digital displays, Linda looked at the red elevator button ahead. The daytime world was waiting for them tomorrow morning, with all its rigid lines and unforgiving expectations. But as she felt the warm weight of Susan's fingers twining with hers in the dark corridor, she realized that the structure they were building wasn't just made of steel and glass, it was made of the silent, unbreakable spaces they created for each other when the rest of the world wasn't looking. The transition from downtown Los Angeles to the heart of Koreatown was a descent into a labyrinth of neon script and shifting textures. The clean, predictable geometry of the financial district dissolved into a vibrant grid of historic brick buildings, subterranean storefronts, and the lingering aroma of toasted sesame oil and charred oak. Susan navigated the SUV through the bustling mid-evening traffic along Wilshire Boulevard with a relaxed familiarity, her thumb tapping a slow cadence against the leather steering wheel. Beside her, Linda leaned her head against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the purple and jade light signs blur into long, shimmering streaks across the pavement. The charcoal suit jacket remained draped over the back seat, leaving her in the white silk blouse that now felt less like a uniform and more like a second skin. "We're abandoning the grid," Linda noted softly, her voice carrying the quiet exhaustion of a 14-hour workday, balanced by a sharp, underlying current of anticipation. "The grid is an illusion, partner," Susan said, smoothly cutting the wheel to guide the heavy vehicle down a narrow, shadowy alleyway flanked by historic concrete facades. She brought the car to a halt near a heavy, unmarked iron door illuminated only by a single, bare amber bulb overhead. LA doesn't live in the straight lines. It lives in the spaces between the master plans. This is one of them. When Susan cut the engine, the sudden silence inside the cabin felt dense, filled with the sudden, heavy awareness of how close they were sitting. Susan didn't move to get out immediately. Instead, she turned in her seat, her arm resting along the center console, her twilight eyes fixed on Linda with an intensity that seemed to thrive in the dim light of the alley. "No corporate titles past this door," Susan murmured, her voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that always managed to dismantle Linda's internal defenses. "Inside, you aren't the senior partner who commands the room. You're just Linda. And I'm just the person who ruined your schedule." Linda turned her head, her gaze meeting Susan's without a hint of the hesitation that had defined her weeks ago. A small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "I think my schedule was ruined the moment you walked into the interview room, Susan. Lead the way." The iron door opened onto a steep flight of concrete stairs that descended into the belly of the building. With every step downward, the muffled, subterranean thump of a double bass grew clearer, vibrating through the soles of Linda's heels. At the bottom of the stairs, Susan pushed open a heavy velvet curtain, revealing a room trapped in a permanent, smoky 1950s twilight. The club was small, intimate, and packed with low-slung circular tables and deep, curved booths upholstered in worn crimson velvet. The only illumination came from small, flickering candles encased in amber glass on each table, and the soft, blue-tinted spotlight focused on the three-piece jazz ensemble performing on a low wooden stage in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, old leather, and the sweet, resinous warmth of the saxophone reed. A host nodded to Susan with the silent familiarity reserved for regulars, guiding them to a secluded booth tucked into the furthest corner of the room, hidden behind a decorative iron screen. As they slid into the semicircular booth, the physical configuration of the space forced a new level of proximity. The table was small, bringing their torsos within inches of each other. Susan slid in deep, her long legs stretching out beneath the table, her knee immediately brushing against Linda's skirt, a steady, intentional contact that neither of them moved to break. A waitress appeared silently, leaving a bottle of smooth, small-batch bourbon and two heavy crystal lowball glasses before vanishing back into the shadows. Susan reached for the bottle, her movements unhurried and fluid. As she poured a amber splash into Linda's glass, her knuckles lightly grazed the inside of Linda's wrist, a slow, electric touch that caused the liquid in the glass to ripple slightly. "To the spaces between the lines," Susan murmured, raising her glass. Linda picked up her own glass, her fingers steady despite the rapid, rhythmic thud of her heart against her ribs. She clinked the crystal against Susan's, the sharp, clear ring melting into the low moan of the saxophone. "To leaving the fortress behind." They drank in a companionable, high-tension silence, the burning warmth of the bourbon cutting through the cool dampness of the underground air. On stage, the pianist began a slow, melancholic ballad, the chords shifting with a lazy, seductive cadence that seemed to dictate the rhythm of the room. Susan set her glass down, her arm extending along the top of the velvet backrest behind Linda's shoulders. She didn't touch her yet, but the proximity of her arm created a pocket of heat that enveloped Linda completely. Susan leaned in closer, her face tilting down so that her breath stirred the loose strands of hair near Linda's ear. "You look different under this light," Susan whispered, her eyes tracking the flickering amber reflection of the candle across Linda's cheekbone and down to the open collar of her shirt. "Less like a blueprint. More like the actual building before the scaffolding goes up." Linda turned her torso toward Susan, her arm resting on the small table, bringing her face close enough to see the tiny gold flecks in Susan's irises. The daytime pretense was entirely gone now, replaced by a raw, mutual hunger that had been compressed through hours of formal board meetings. "And how does the building look, Susan?" Linda asked, her voice dropping to a soft, challenging whisper that carried a dangerous confidence. "Audacious," Susan murmured, her gaze dropping to Linda's lips before rising back to her eyes. "Beautifully complicated. The kind of structure an architect spends their entire career trying to figure out how to keep stable." Susan raised her free hand, her index finger sliding slowly along the edge of the mahogany table until it touched the cuff of Linda's sleeve. She didn't take Linda's hand immediately. Instead, her fingertip began a slow, agonizingly sweet exploration, tracing the thin line of the silver cufflink, then moving upward to stroke the delicate skin over the radial artery on Linda's wrist. Linda's breath hitched, the sensation of Susan's thumb against her pulse point sending a wave of intense, delicious friction straight to her core. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, opening her palm, her fingers twining tightly with Susan's, locking their hands together on the dark wood of the table. "I've spent 10 years ensuring everything in my life is stable, Susan," Linda whispered, her grip tightening as Susan's thumb continued its rhythmic stroke. "And in the span of 3 weeks, you've managed to introduce enough kinetic energy to threaten the entire foundation." "The foundation is fine," Susan said softly, her playful smirk returning for a brief second before dissolving into an expression of absolute sincerity. She leaned even closer, the tip of her nose brushing gently against Linda's temple. "It's the walls that are coming down, Linda. And they needed to come down." The honesty of the statement left no room for retreat. Linda let her eyes close for a brief second, her head tilting slightly to rest against Susan's shoulder. The heavy, bluesy notes of the piano seemed to wrap around them, insulating their corner from the rest of the crowded room. Here, under the cover of the amber shadows and the low music, the rigid hierarchy of Vance Associates was entirely irrelevant. They were simply 2 women caught in the irresistible pull of a gravity they had both tried, and failed, to ignore. Susan's arm slid down from the backrest, her hand settling firmly around Linda's waist, her fingers pressing into the silk of her blouse, pulling her flush against her side. The warmth of Susan's body was absolute, a steady, grounding force that made the rest of the world feel distant and inconsequential. "Look at me," Susan murmured against her hair. Linda lifted her head from Susan's shoulder, her eyes opening to find Susan's face just inches away. The distance between them had narrowed to almost nothing, the air between their lips charged with a tight, cold energy that felt like a physical weight. Susan didn't rush the moment. She reached up with her free hand, her warm fingers cupping the side of Linda's neck, her thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, lifting her face slightly. Her gaze was deliberate, searching, ensuring that Linda was entirely present in the space they had claimed. "No deadlines tomorrow morning," Susan whispered, her breath sweet against Linda's mouth. "No clients. No revisions. Just this." "Just this," Linda agreed, her voice barely a breath. Susan closed the remaining distance, her lips meeting Linda's in a kiss that was deeply tender, yet laced with the intense, pent-up frustration of the past 2 weeks of forced professional distance. It wasn't the frantic, rushed contact of the elevator, nor the quiet exploration on the hood of the car. This was a deep, deliberate declaration, a slow alignment of rhythm and heat that made Linda's hands rise instinctively to grasp the fabric of Susan's shirt, anchoring herself to the solid reality of the woman holding her. Susan's grip on her waist tightened, her fingers possessive and firm as she pulled Linda closer into the deep curve of the velvet booth. The music on the stage seemed to swell and recede around them, a beautiful, distant backdrop to the sharp, intense focus of their shared warmth. When Susan finally pulled back, her lips lingered against the corner of Linda's mouth for a fraction of a second before her forehead came to rest against Linda's. Both of them were breathing softly, the rhythm of their chests syncopated in the dark corner. Linda let out a quiet, contented sigh, her fingers slowly releasing their tight grip on Susan's shirt, instead smoothing down the wrinkled cotton before resting flat against Susan's chest, feeling the rapid, powerful beat of her heart. "You're a very dangerous consultant, Susan," Linda murmured, a genuine, relaxed smile finally breaking across her face. "I'm an asset to the firm," Susan smiled back, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she kissed the tip of Linda's nose. My methods are simply unconventional. They stayed in the booth for another hour, finishing the wine in a soft, easy conversation that ranged from childhood memories to the absurd habits of their corporate clients, the professional distance completely replaced by an easy, domestic familiarity. By the time they climbed the concrete stairs back up to the alleyway, the midnight hour had long since passed. The air in Koreatown had turned crisp and clear, the marine layer from the coast washing over the brick buildings and cooling the lingering heat from the basement club. Susan tucked her hands into her pockets as they walked side by side toward the car, her shoulder lightly bumping against Linda's with every step. The alley was quiet now, the neon signs down Wilshire beginning to blink off one by one. Linda stopped near the passenger door, looking up at the sky where a sliver of the moon was visible between the high-rise silhouettes. She felt a profound, unfamiliar sense of lightness in her chest, the realization that the structure she had spent her life protecting didn't need to be a prison. Susan walked up behind her, her presence a warm shield against the midnight breeze. She didn't say anything, she simply reached out, her fingers sliding into Linda's hand, twining their fingers together in the quiet dark of the alley. "Let's go home," Susan whispered. Linda turned her head, looking into those twilight eyes that had redefined her entire landscape, and nodded. "Yes. Let's go home." The private elevator of the Skycrest residences did not announce its movement with mechanical shudders or sudden jerks. It climbed 42 floors in a smooth, near-silent rush of velocity, the numbers on the brushed metal indicator ticking upward like a digital heartbeat. Inside the small, mirrored capsule, the air was different from the office tower or the subterranean jazz club. It was cool, filtered, and redolent of a subtle, expensive white tea fragrance that Linda had curated for her home. Susan leaned her back against the glass pane, her arms crossed over her chest, her cream blazer slung casually over one forearm. She wasn't looking at her own reflection. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Linda, who stood near the control panel, her profile silhouetted against the ambient blue light of the elevator interior. The formal charcoal jacket was still missing, and without it, the slight movement of Linda's shoulders as she breathed was fully visible. "You haven't checked your phone once since we left Koreatown," Susan observed, her voice a low, melodic murmur that seemed to fill the small space completely. "I believe that breaks at least 3 executive protocols." Linda didn't look back, but the corner of her mouth ticked upward in a faint, private smile. She reached out, her finger hovering over the biometric scanner of the penthouse entrance as the lift chimed softly, the doors sliding open directly into her living room. "The firm pays for my attention from 9 to 5, Susan. The remaining hours are currently unmapped." Stepping out of the elevator was like entering a temple dedicated to structural precision. Linda's penthouse was a vast, open-concept expanse of white Carrara marble, polished concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass walls that wrapped around the entire perimeter of the building. There were no decorative trinkets, no chaotic bookshelves, and no hanging ferns. Every piece of furniture, from the low-profile Italian leather sofa to the stark, minimalist kitchen island, was aligned along a perfect grid. Outside the glass, the skyline of downtown LA was a massive, brilliant wall of light, the skyscrapers of the financial district looking close enough to touch. Susan stepped out onto the marble floor, her bare feet, having discarded her sneakers in the car, making no sound against the smooth stone. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her eyes sweeping over the vast, quiet space before turning back to Linda. "It's exactly what I expected," Susan said softly, tossing her blazer onto the back of the leather sofa without asking for permission. The contrast between her relaxed, bohemian presence and the sterile perfection of the room was striking, a deliberate disruption of Linda's order. A textbook definition of architectural control. You've successfully eliminated all variable elements, Linda. Linda walked over to the kitchen island, setting her keys and bag down on the stone surface with a small, definitive click. She observed Susan's movement, watching the way the dark silk of Susan's shirt caught the reflection of the distant city lights. Variable elements introduce risk, Susan. Risk leads to structural failure. Risk also leads to this, Susan countered, turning around to face her. She didn't stay in the center of the room. Instead, she walked over to the island, her movements lazy, fluid, and entirely focused. She stopped just across the narrow marble counter from Linda, leaning forward until her face was within the radius of Linda's warmth. You can't build a life out of load sheets and straight lines, boss. Eventually, the material has to bend. The proximity across the counter was an exquisite form of torture. Linda could see the faint, dark gold flecks in Susan's irises, illuminated by the cold blue light of the city outside. The scent of the bourbon they had shared, mixed with the warm leather of Susan's skin, cut through the clinical air of the penthouse. And what if I don't want it to bend? Linda whispered, her voice losing its executive authority, softening into something fragile and exposed. Susan reached across the white marble, her hand moving slowly, deliberately, giving Linda ample time to step back. Linda stayed exactly where she was. Susan's warm fingers did not touch Linda's hand, instead, they moved upward, her index finger gently catching the silver pin that held Linda's hair in its strict, flawless boardroom twist. With a slow, deft twist of her wrist, Susan pulled the pin free. The effect was instantaneous. The heavy, dark waves of Linda's hair tumbled down around her shoulders, breaking the rigid symmetry of her silhouette. A few stray locks fell across her cheek, softening the sharp line of her jawline. Linda let out a quiet, sudden breath, her eyes closing for a brief second as the physical release of the hair felt like the collapse of her final barrier. When she opened her eyes, Susan was watching her with an expression of pure, unadulterated focus, a gaze so heavy with affection and hunger that Linda felt the marble counter beneath her fingers grow suddenly unstable. "There," Susan whispered, her voice dropping an octave as she laid the silver pin down on the stone. "The fortress has a leak." Linda didn't answer with words. The tension that had been compressed through days of formal meetings and professional distance finally snapped. She stepped around the edge of the kitchen island, closing the distance between them once and for all. She didn't wait for Susan to make the move. She reached out, her hands finding the open collar of Susan's dark shirt, her fingers curling into the fabric to pull her close. Susan met her halfway, her arm coming around Linda's waist with a sudden, possessive force that lifted Linda slightly off her feet, pressing her back against the edge of the marble island. The contact was absolute, the contrast between the cold stone behind Linda and the intense, radiating heat of Susan's body creating a delicious, overwhelming friction. The kiss was deep, deliberate, and laced with a sweet, high chemistry pull that made the rest of the penthouse vanish into the shadows. Susan's lips were warm, parting Linda's with an unhurried confidence that demanded entirely everything Linda had kept hidden behind her corporate titles. Linda let her eyes close completely, her hands moving from Susan's collar to climb up into the thick, wild curls at the back of Susan's neck, anchoring herself against the sheer velocity of the emotion rushing through her chest. Susan shifted her position, her thighs framing Linda's, her hand moving from Linda's waist to slide slowly up the silk of her blouse, her palm flat against Linda's back, feeling the rapid, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Every touch was an unspoken question, and every movement of Linda's body was an absolute, unyielding answer. When Susan finally pulled back, just an inch, her breathing was shallow and rough around the edges. Her forehead rested against Linda's, her thumb gently tracing the line of Linda's lower lip, which was now dark and slightly swollen from the intensity of the kiss. "Calculated chaos," Susan murmured, a faint, breathless smile touching her lips as she looked into Linda's dazed, dark eyes. "I believe the load capacity of this room has just been exceeded." Linda let out a quiet, soft laugh, her hands still resting on Susan's shoulders, her fingers lightly kneading the muscles there. She looked past Susan's profile at the massive wall of glass, where the lights of the city below seemed to blink in silent approval. "You are completely unmanageable, Consultant Susan." "You shouldn't try to manage me, Senior Partner Linda," Susan whispered, her lips brushing the corner of Linda's mouth in a lingering, sweet promise before she took Linda's hand, twining their fingers together. "You should just come with me." Susan guided her away from the kitchen, leading her across the wide marble floor toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no chairs near the glass, only the open expanse of the view. Susan sat down directly on the polished concrete floor, her back against one of the structural columns, and pulled Linda down beside her. Linda settled into the space, her long legs stretching out parallel to Susan's, her side pressed firmly against Susan's torso. Susan's arm came around her shoulders, drawing Linda back until her head rested comfortably in the crook of Susan's neck. The cold glass of the window was just inches away, but the interior of their small circle was entirely warm. Below them, the 110 freeway looked like a river of gold, the cars reduced to tiny dots of light moving through the midnight hour. The silence of the penthouse was absolute now, the distant hum of the city insulated by 3 inches of reinforced glass. "I used to sit here every night after the partners' dinners," Linda said softly, her eyes tracing the dark silhouette of the City Hall tower in the distance. Her hand rested on Susan's knee, her thumb tracing slow, rhythmic patterns over the dark fabric of Susan's trousers. "I would look at all these lights and try to calculate exactly how many square feet of real estate I was responsible for. I thought that if I knew the exact dimensions of everything, nothing could surprise me." Susan didn't speak immediately. She reached down with her free hand, her fingers gently twining through the loose waves of Linda's hair, untangling the remaining knots with a patience that made Linda's chest ache with a sweet, heavy warmth. "And now?" Susan asked quietly, her breath warm against Linda's temple. Linda turned her head slightly, her nose brushing against the soft skin of Susan's neck before she looked up into those twilight eyes. "Now, I'm looking at the horizon, and I realize I don't care about the square footage at all. I only care about the variable element sitting next to me." Susan's expression softened completely, the playful defiance vanishing to reveal the raw, grounded sincerity that Linda had come to rely on. She tightened her grip around Linda's waist, pulling her even closer until they were moving with the exact same breath. "The variable element isn't going anywhere, Linda," Susan whispered, her lips meeting Linda's in a short, extraordinarily sweet kiss that carried the weight of a definitive contract. "We built the foundation 2 weeks ago in that elevator. The rest of this is just the expansion." They stayed by the window for hours, watching the gold and ruby lights of the Los Angeles freeway slowly thin out as the night deepened toward 3 in the morning. The corporate pretense that had protected them during the daylight hours had been entirely deconstructed, replaced by a quiet, unshakable alignment that didn't require rules or boundaries to hold its weight. As Linda closed her eyes, her head resting securely against Susan's chest, she realized that steel and glass were strong, but the most resilient structures were the ones that knew exactly how to bend in the dark.